Does the parched earth cry out for rain, or merely endure the sun's relentless dominion? In the rolling hills of Andalusia, where vineyards clung to slopes like desperate prayers, Mateo Vargas often felt the land's thirst as his own. The late 19th century sun beat down, baking the soil of his family's small vineyard, a legacy shrinking under the shadow of debt and the ever-growing power of Don Rafael Montero, whose grand hacienda surveyed the valley like a watchful hawk. Mateo, lean and sun-darkened, his hands calloused from ceaseless work, felt the weight of his ancestors' pride crushing him. He'd had schooling, dreams whispered by the village priest, Father Ignacio, but the failing vines demanded his sweat, not his studies. The scar on his forearm, a pale crescent from a childhood encounter with a stubborn plough, throbbed sometimes, a reminder of battles fought and barely won against this unforgiving land. Water, the lifeblood, flowed generously towards the Don's vast estates, leaving trickles for smaller plots like his own. It was an old injustice, accepted like the summer heat, but bitterness festered in Mateo's quiet heart. He was 23, carrying the burdens of a man twice his age, his thoughtful eyes scanning the horizon not for beauty, but for the telltale signs of the steward's approach, or the distant plume of dust signalling the Don's carriage. Elena Garcia knew the hawk's shadow well. It fell even upon the cramped, whitewashed dwelling she shared with her younger sister Isabel, on the edge of the village, technically part of Don Rafael's holdings. At 19, she possessed a resilience forged in loss, her parents taken by fever and hardship years ago, and a fierce love for Isabel, a bright spark of innocence in their impoverished world. Elena's hands, strong and deft, moved tirelessly, whether binding harvested grapes under the brutal sun or weaving intricate patterns on her small loom late into the night, selling the colourful sashes and cloths for meagre coins. She was striking, her dark eyes holding both the weariness of her life and an untamed spirit. Don Rafael's gaze often lingered on her, heavy and possessive, during his infrequent tours of the village. She met it with a carefully blank expression, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, masked by pride. She worked his fields during the vendimia, the grape harvest, her movements efficient, her presence self-contained, always keeping Isabel close. Survival was a constant negotiation, dignity her only shield. Their paths crossed inevitably during that year's harvest. The air hung thick with the scent of crushed grapes and sweat. An overseer, eager to impress the distant Don, barked an order at Isabel, who had stumbled, dropping a small basket. Before the man could unleash further ire, Mateo stepped quietly between them. He didn't raise his voice, simply met the overseer's glare with a steady, unwavering look. "She is a child. A moment's rest harms no vine," he said, his tone low but firm. The overseer, surprised by the quiet defiance from a struggling smallholder, hesitated, then grumbled and moved on. Elena murmured a barely audible "Gracias," her eyes meeting Mateo's for a fleeting charged second. In that instant, they saw mirrored in each other the same banked fire of resentment, the same weary endurance. It was a spark of recognition in the shared dust and toil. The spark, however small, did not go unnoticed. Don Rafael, perhaps informed by his steward, or perhaps simply deciding the time was ripe, tightened his grip. A message arrived for Elena, delivered by the same dismissive steward Mateo knew well. The rent on their small home was to increase, effective immediately, to an impossible sum. Alternatively, the steward suggested with a sly look, Elena could perform additional duties at the hacienda. Lighter work, naturally. The implication hung heavy and vile in the still air. Elena felt the familiar cold dread wash over her, but this time it was laced with panic. Eviction meant ruin, exposure for Isabel. Simultaneously, Mateo discovered the stream feeding his lower vineyard had slowed to a muddy crawl. He traced it back, finding a crudely constructed, temporary dam diverting the precious flow entirely towards one of Don Rafael's larger olive groves. It was blatant, arrogant theft. The hawk was circling, talons extended. The separate threads of their struggles were being pulled taut by the same hand, drawing them towards an unavoidable confrontation. Elena felt trapped, while Mateo felt a surge of cold, focused anger replace his usual weary resignation. The time for quiet endurance was over. Mateo sought out the steward first, attempting reason. "The water diversion," he began, keeping his voice steady. "It leaves my vines dry. There must be some mistake." The steward, a stout man mimicking his master's arrogance, barely looked at him. Don Raphael manages his resources as he sees fit, Vargas. Perhaps you should manage your debts better. Dismissal, curt and absolute. The injustice burned. Later, Mateo found Father Ignacio tending the small church garden, the scent of herbs mixing with the dust. Padre, Mateo began, the word thick with frustration. Don Raphael, he strangles us. The water, the rents. Father Ignacio sighed, his weathered face etched with concern. His power grows, Mateo, and his heart shrinks. He forgets that we are all God's children, tended by the same sun, needing the same rain. He paused, wiping soil from his hands. There are old records, parish ledgers, contracts from before. Sometimes truth hides in plain sight if one knows where to look. But be wary, my son. The hawk has sharp eyes and sharper claws. The priest's words were both encouragement and warning, planting a seed of an idea in Mateo's mind. Proof, tangible evidence, might be the only weapon against brute power. He found Elena near the village well later that day, Isabel playing nearby. Her usual composure seemed brittle, her eyes shadowed with worry. He approached cautiously. Elena, I heard about the rent. She looked up, startled, then nodded curtly, her pride warring with her fear. Don Raphael is generous with his demands, she said, bitterness tinging her voice. Quietly, Mateo told her about the water diversion. He takes from us all, he said, the shared grievance forging a fragile bridge between them. We cannot fight him alone. For the first time, Elena truly met his gaze, seeing not just a fellow sufferer, but a potential ally, someone whose quiet strength mirrored her own resilience. Fight him? She whispered, the word tasting of danger. How? With truth, Mateo replied, the conviction solidifying within him. If I can find proof of his cheating. In that shared moment of vulnerability and dawning resolve, something shifted. The space between them, once defined by social distance and shared hardship, now held the faint, dangerous glimmer of hope and the subtle warmth of mutual reliance. Their growing connection did not escape Don Raphael's notice. He saw them speaking, saw the flicker of defiance in Elena's eyes when Mateo was near. His visits to the village edge became more frequent, his manner towards Elena shifting from veiled suggestion to oily charm laced with menace. Such beauty should not toil so, he remarked one afternoon, letting his gaze travel over her deliberately as she scrubbed laundry. The hacienda has need of skilled hands and pleasant company. He offered Isabel a sweet, his smile cold. A delicate flower like your sister needs protection. This village can be unsafe. The threat was unmistakable. Elena pulled Isabel closer, her heart pounding, but refused to cower. We manage, Don Raphael. Thank you for your concern. Her polite refusal only seemed to fuel his possessiveness. He saw her not as a person, but as a prize being kept from him by an insignificant farmer. Fueled by Elena's fear and his own sense of outrage, Mateo redoubled his efforts. He spent evenings poring over dusty ledgers in the church vestry, Father Ignacio offering quiet guidance, pointing out discrepancies in old land surveys, water rights agreements signed decades ago. He spoke discreetly to older villagers, gathering whispers of past injustices, families ruined by Don Raphael's father and the Don himself, tales of coerced land sales, usurious loans. One evening, hidden deep within a forgotten chest, Mateo found it, a faded contract detailing water allocation from the main spring, clearly showing the historical rights of the smaller plots, rights Don Raphael had systematically ignored and overridden. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was solid proof of long-term, calculated theft. Hope surged, fierce and bright. He had a weapon, but the hawk struck before he could wield it. Perhaps an informant warned the Don, perhaps it was sheer spite. One moonless night, as Elena and Isabel slept, a flicker of orange light danced outside their small window. Elena woke to the smell of smoke, thick and acrid. Stumbling outside, she saw flames licking at the dry thatch of their small storage shed, perilously close to the house itself. Panic seized her. She screamed for Isabel, dragging her sleepy sister out into the cool night air just as the flames roared higher. Neighbours rushed out, forming a bucket brigade from the well, their shouts mingling with the crackle of fire. Mateo, alerted by the commotion, arrived breathless, his face grim as he helped battle the blaze. They saved the house, but the shed and Elena's stored weaving supplies were lost. No one saw who started it, of course. But Elena saw Don Rafael's steward watching from the shadows at the edge of the crowd, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes before he melted away. The message was terrifyingly clear. Defiance would be met with destruction. The fire broke something within Elena. The terror, the near loss of Isabel, the feeling of utter helplessness against Don Rafael's invisible, malevolent hand, it silenced her. Not completely, not physically, but emotionally. She retreated into a shell of fear. Her vibrant spirit dimmed. She still cared for Isabel, still worked mechanically, but the light in her eyes was gone, replaced by a haunted watchfulness. She spoke only when absolutely necessary, her voice a low monotone. She flinched at sudden noises, avoided Matteo's gaze, her trauma wrapping around her like a shroud. Matteo watched, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt. Had his investigation provoked this? An incandescent rage. He tried to speak to her, to offer comfort, but she seemed locked away, unreachable. Don Rafael, observing her subdued state, likely interpreted it as submission. He believed he had finally crushed her spirit, clearing the path for his desires. The silence that fell over Elena was a victory cry in his ears. Don Rafael, basking in his perceived triumph, decided to celebrate. His annual harvest festival, the Fiesta de la Cosecha, was announced, a grand affair at the Hacienda, designed to showcase his wealth and dominance over the valley. Invitations went out to neighbouring landowners, local officials, and, as a gesture of condescending patronage, the villagers were permitted to attend, to partake of leftover food and wine and witness his glory. For Matteo, the timing felt like a divine sign, a stage set for the truth. Elena's trauma had galvanized him, caution warred with the desperate need for justice. He held the proof, the water contract, testimonies he'd carefully documented. He spoke again with Father Ignacio, who agreed to safeguard copies. Then, Matteo did something risky. He quietly approached a few other smallholders, men who had suffered silently under Don Rafael's thumb for years, sharing fragments of his evidence, appealing not just to their wallets but to their long-suppressed dignity. Fear was palpable, but so was a flicker of shared resentment. He wasn't asking them to fight, only to bear witness. Elena remained withdrawn, but when Matteo told her, his voice low and determined, "He will answer for what he's done, Elena." At the fiesta, he saw a brief spark, a tremor of awareness in her haunted eyes before the shutters closed again. The night of the fiesta arrived, draped in false gaiety. Lanterns glowed in the hacienda courtyard, music drifted on the warm air, wine flowed freely. Don Rafael presided, expansive and smug, accepting compliments, his eyes occasionally sweeping over the villagers huddled at the periphery, seeking out Elena. She was there, brought by a neighbour looking pale and ethereal, Isabel clinging tightly to her hand. Matteo stood amongst the villagers, the vital documents concealed beneath his simple jacket, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the opportune moment when the Don was holding court, surrounded by his influential guests. Then, stepping forward from the crowd, his voice ringing clear in a sudden lull in the music, Matteo spoke. "Don Rafael Montero!" Heads turned, conversations died. Surprise flickered across the Don's face, quickly replaced by annoyance. "I have something to say, something everyone here deserves to hear." Matteo ignored the steward's move to intercept him. Calmly, deliberately, he began, laying out the evidence. The historical water rights, the systematic deprivation, the forged entries in ledgers he suspected existed, the pattern of exploitation. He spoke of families driven to ruin, of resources hoarded while others starved. He didn't explicitly mention the fire, but he spoke of the climate of fear, the unfortunate accidents that befell those who displeased the Don. A collective gasp went through the crowd, villagers and gentry alike. The air crackled with tension. "Lies! Insolence!" Don Rafael roared, his face purpling with rage. "Seize this peasant!" His guards moved forward, but hesitated as murmurs rose from the villagers. Some of the smallholders Matteo had spoken to stood straighter, their eyes fixed on the Don with newfound courage. Father Ignacio emerged from the edge of the crowd, holding a small bound book, a copy of the parish records Matteo had shown him. The priest didn't speak, but his presence was a powerful statement. Don Rafael seemed momentarily stunned by the priest's silent rebuke, and then the breaking point. Elena, who had watched Matteo with widening eyes, suddenly stepped forward, pulling free from the neighbour's grasp. Her face was pale but resolute. She looked directly at Don Raphael, her voice, though trembling, cutting through the silence. "Liar!" she cried out, the single word echoing in the courtyard. Then, turning to Matteo, she reached out and grasped his hand, a gesture of absolute solidarity, of fear finally overcome. The sight of her defiance, her voice reclaimed, sent a shockwave through the onlookers. The spell of Don Raphael's intimidation was broken. The fiesta dissolved into chaos, but not the kind Don Raphael intended. His powerful guests shifted uncomfortably, distancing themselves. The villagers, witnessing his humiliation and Elena's courage, found their own voices, murmuring agreement, sharing their own long-held grievances in hushed tones. Don Raphael's authority evaporated under the weight of public exposure and Elena's dramatic stand. Matteo quickly passed his documents to Father Ignacio for safekeeping. Don Raphael's sputtering threats found himself isolated, his power revealed as a hollow shell built on fear and deceit. He wasn't arrested. His connections likely ran too deep for immediate legal retribution, but his reputation was shattered, his dominance irrevocably fractured. The night ended not with his triumph, but with his disgrace. In the quiet aftermath, change came slowly, like the turning seasons. Don Raphael, facing social ostracization and potential investigations triggered by Matteo's evidence, lost much of his unchallenged influence. Water flowed a little more freely, rents became marginally fairer, though the deep lines of class and wealth remained etched onto the Andalusian landscape. Matteo, no longer just a struggling farmer, but a man who had dared to speak truth to power, earned a new respect.